A barrister wrote into the channel last week. The line in his email that the panel has not stopped thinking about was this: Claude is the best associate I have ever had. Not the best research tool, not the best assistant, the best associate. That word choice was not casual. It was the word a working practitioner reached for when describing what the experience actually feels like in real practice, after the first 3 months of working with the model on real matters. This is the editorial premise of the series the channel is opening up now, The Associate, a series about working with Claude the way a senior practitioner works with an associate, rather than using Claude the way one uses a tool. The distinction matters because the verbs change when the frame changes, and the verbs are what determine whether your practice gets the value out of the model or not. You do not deploy an associate, you delegate to them, you brief them, you read their work, you correct them, you develop them, you trust them with more over time, or you do not. This first episode covers the most important skill in that relationship, the one that compounds every other piece of the work: how to read an associate's first draft. The skill that distinguishes the senior practitioners who get genuine leverage from Claude from the ones who do not. 0.5 seconds. Reading an associate's first draft is not the same as reading a finished work product. It is a specific skill with a specific structure that senior practitioners develop over years of practice, and that, in the panel's experience, is the skill most commonly skipped when practitioners first start working with Claude. The skill has 3 layers. The first layer is separating substance from polish, which is the work of recognizing that an associate has the right idea wrapped in the wrong language, or the wrong idea wrapped in plausible-sounding language. Junior associates fail at the substance layer constantly. The senior practitioner who corrects only the polish without checking the substance is the senior practitioner who signs a brief that says exactly what they wanted it to say while making an argument that is wrong on the law. The second layer is separating judgment from research. An associate's first draft contains both. The research is the authorities surveyed, the cases cited, the documents reviewed. The judgment is which case anchors the argument, which document carries the weight, which threshold matters most for the matter at hand. Research can be checked. The judgment has to be assessed for whether the associate has made the right call or whether you, the senior, need to override. The third layer is separating what is right from what is defensible. An associate's draft can be technically defensible without being right, in the way that matters for the case. The senior practitioner reads not just for whether the argument can be sustained on appeal, but for whether it serves the client's actual interest in this specific matter. This layer is the hardest to teach, and it is the layer that distinguishes a competent associate review from an excellent one. Claude produces first drafts that look different from junior associate first drafts in a specific way, and the senior practitioner who does not understand the difference reads Claude's work less well than they read a human junior's work. The first difference is that Claude's drafts are more confident. A junior associate hedges naturally in their first year. They write, "The case may stand for," and "it appears that," and "this could be interpreted as." Claude does not hedge by default. The drafts come back with declarative confidence, regardless of whether the underlying authority warrants it. The senior practitioner who is used to junior associate hedging as a signal of uncertainty has to recalibrate their reading. The second difference is that Claude's drafts are more internally consistent. A junior associate's draft will sometimes contradict itself between page 2 and page 7 because the associate has not held the whole argument in their head while drafting. Claude holds the whole argument by construction. The drafts are tighter and more structurally coherent, which means errors hide better inside them. The senior practitioner has to look harder for the seams where the argument breaks. The third difference is that Claude's drafts arrive faster. A junior associate produces a first draft in 2 days. Claude produces one in 15 minutes. The senior practitioner who reads Claude's draft in the same time budget they would give a junior is making a category error. The draft arrived faster, which means the review gets a different time allocation. Most of the work in working with Claude is in the reading, not in the prompting. The panel uses a 4-pass read for Claude's first drafts. The same 4-pass structure works for junior associate drafts too, which is part of why it is worth learning. The passes are different from each other, they happen in a specific order, and each pass catches a different category of error. Pass 1 is the substance pass. You read the draft quickly, once, looking only for whether the underlying argument is the right argument. Does the draft answer the question that was actually asked? Does the legal proposition the draft is built around match the proposition the matter requires? Is the draft trying to prove the right thing? This pass takes 10 minutes for a 2,000-word draft. It is the most important pass, and it is the pass that practitioners most often skip because they want to start fixing the polish. Pass 2 is the judgment pass. You read the draft a second time, looking specifically at the strategic calls the associate has made. Which case anchors the argument? Which authority does the heavy lifting? Which counterargument the draft engages with and which it ignores? This pass takes 15 minutes, and it is where the senior practitioner adds the most value, because the strategic calls are what the lawyer is paid for. Pass 3 is the research pass. You spot-check the citations, verify the propositions, and confirm the authority survives the read. The 15-minute verification protocol from Foundations number 6 runs here. This pass takes the longest, and most of it is mechanical work that is honest but not strategic. Pass 4 is the polish pass. You read the draft for tone, clarity, structure, and style. This pass takes 10 minutes, and it is the pass that senior practitioners spend the most time on by default, but should spend the least time on under the 4-pass discipline. The polish matters, but it matters last. I know what you are thinking. You are thinking that the 4 passes sound right in theory, but that in practice, you read drafts holistically. That you can see substance and polish and judgment in a single read, and that breaking the read into discrete passes feels artificial and inefficient. The panel thought the same thing for years. Here is what changed the panel's mind. Holistic reading works when you are reading work from an associate whose drafting habits you know. You can tell at a glance whether the draft is in trouble because you know what trouble looks like in that specific associate's voice. You read 3 sentences and you have already recalibrated. When the draft is from a new associate, or from Claude, the holistic read does not work as well because you do not have the prior pattern to read against. The 4-pass discipline solves this by separating the checks rather than relying on pattern recognition. The discipline becomes most valuable in the early months of draft, working with Claude on a new practice profile, when the pattern recognition has not yet developed. Once you have read 300 Claude drafts in your specific practice area, holistic reading returns as an option. But the 4-pass discipline is the bridge from no pattern recognition to mature pattern recognition, and it is the bridge most practitioners need. There is one more piece. The 4-pass discipline also catches the errors that holistic reading misses because Claude's drafts read as more polished than they are. The discipline forces you to look at substance separately from polish, which is the read that polished drafts evade. Even when your pattern recognition matures, the 4-pass discipline remains useful for drafts that are unusually polished, unusually long, or on matters where the stakes make a quick read too risky. The prompt you give Claude when requesting the draft shapes how easy the draft is to read. The panel has refined a prompt structure over the last 12 months that produces drafts which are noticeably easier to read under the 4-pass discipline. The prompt asks Claude to mark its own work in ways that make each pass faster. The prompt looks something like the following. Draft the research memo on the question above. As you draft, do the following. First, mark every load-bearing legal proposition with a confidence rating, high, medium, or low, based on how confident you are in the underlying authority. Second, flag every strategic call you make. Choices about which case anchors the argument, which counter-argument to engage with, which threshold to prioritize. Mark these in line with a strategic call note. Third, identify the parts of the draft where you are relying on synthesis rather than direct authority, so I can review the synthesis carefully. The draft that comes back looks slightly different from an unprompted draft. The confidence ratings are visible, the strategic calls are flagged, the synthesis passages are identified. Pass 1 and Pass 2 of the 4-pass read become substantially faster because Claude has already done the work of surfacing what needs your attention. The prompt does not replace the 4-pass discipline. It makes the discipline faster. The senior practitioner who uses both the prompt and the discipline together gets through Claude's drafts in roughly half the time of practitioners who use neither. The 4-pass read does not delegate any judgment to the model. The lawyer is the one who reads. The lawyer is the one who decides what the draft means. The lawyer is the one who corrects, who escalates, who signs off. The reading is more efficient with the prompt, more structured with the discipline, faster with practice. The reading is not optional, and it is not automatable. The practitioner who hands Claude a draft and signs it without the 4-pass read is the practitioner who will be in the next sanctions case the panel covers. The practitioner who runs the 4-pass read consistently is the practitioner who turns Claude into the best associate they have ever had, in the same way Julian described. The skill of reading a first draft is the skill that makes Claude valuable in skilled hands and dangerous in unskilled ones. It is the most important skill in working with Claude as an associate, and it is the skill the channel is going to keep returning to across the rest of this series. There is one more piece of reading an associate's first draft that the workflow framing misses entirely, and that the associate framing surfaces immediately. The question of how to correct. When you correct a junior associate's draft, you have choices about how to do it. You can rewrite the section yourself and hand it back without comment. You can mark the errors and ask the associate to redraft. You can explain the underlying principle and ask the associate to apply it. The choice you make shapes the associate's development, the relationship, and what you get back next time. A good senior practitioner makes these choices deliberately, even when they are doing it under time pressure. The same choices exist with Claude, and the choice you make shapes what Claude produces on the next draft. If you rewrite the section yourself, Claude learns nothing because the corrected version does not get fed back. If you mark the errors and ask Claude to redraft, the next draft will be better, but the underlying issue may persist. If you explain the underlying principle and ask Claude to apply it, the next draft will be substantively different and the practice profile compounds. The last option takes longer in the moment and saves time across the next 10 matters. The senior practitioners who get the most out of working with Claude treat correction as development. They explain what was wrong, why it was wrong, and what the model should do differently. They invest in the corrections because they understand that the practice profile compounds and that the model gets noticeably better at their specific work over the first 3 months of this discipline. The practitioners who treat Claude as a tool correct as a transaction. They get a tool's performance out of the model. The practitioners who treat Claude as an associate correct as a relationship. They get an associate's performance. 3 situations where the 4-pass read does not work as advertised, and the panel wants to be honest about each one. The first is when you do not actually know the matter well enough to assess the substance pass. If the matter has shifted recently, if you have not personally read the underlying documents, if the practice area is adjacent to your core work but not central to it, then the substance pass becomes a guess rather than a read. The discipline is no protection against ignorance of the matter. Read the underlying documents first. The 4 passes assume a foundation of matter knowledge. The second is when the time pressure is genuinely extreme. The 4-pass read takes 50 minutes for a 2,000-word draft. If you have 15 minutes before the filing deadline, the discipline collapses to a single combined pass that catches the major errors but misses the subtle ones. This is acceptable occasionally and dangerous as a habit. If the 4-pass read is consistently impossible in your practice has a structural problem that is bigger than how you read drafts. The third is when the relationship itself is wrong. If you have not built the practice profile, have not invested in the corrections, have not developed the working relationship over the first 3 months, then Claude's drafts will not be drafts you can read efficiently, regardless of the discipline. The 4-pass read works on associate work. It does not work on the work of a model you have never worked with before, in the same way that reading a brief from an associate you have never met is harder than reading one from an associate you have worked with for 3 years. The 4-pass read on one slide. The order matters more than any individual pass. The discipline of doing them separately is what makes the read better than holistic reading, particularly in the first 3 months of working with Claude on a new practice profile. Pass 1, Substance, 10 minutes. Pass 2, Judgment, 15 minutes. Pass 3, Research, the longest, with verification running. Pass 4, Polish, 10 minutes, last. The prompt that asks Claude to flag confidence ratings and strategic calls makes passes 1 and 2 substantially faster. Treat the corrections as development, not as transactions. The practice profile compounds over the first 3 months. Reading Claude's drafts the way you would read an associate's drafts is the skill that turns Claude from a tool into the best associate you have ever had. That is the editorial promise of this series, and it starts with this skill, because every other skill in the series depends on the senior. Practitioner being able to read first drafts well. That was the first episode of The Associate. 8 more in the opening arc. Each one names one dimension of how a senior practitioner relates to a competent associate, and walks through what that looks like with Claude. The next episode covers how to brief an associate you just met, which extends the practice profile setup into the relational frame. The episode after that covers how to delegate the work that does not need you, which is the strategic decision about which workflows to push to the model and which to keep in-house. The associate runs alongside Foundations and Unpacked, which together cover the 3 editorial dimensions of working with Claude as a practitioner: the workflow layer, the product layer, and now the relationship layer. Together, they make this channel cover legal AI more completely than any other channel doing this work. If you have been working with Claude long enough that you have started to think of the model as something more than a tool, this series is for you. Read the drafts well. Correct as development. Develop the practice profile. Trust the relationship to compound. That is the work. That's the episode. See you in the next one.